So every sector and every part of our society is contributing in some way, and this is a global picture, that's not just focusing on the UK. So how might we move to a low-carbon society? How might we affect this transition? Now, I've read and analysed many of the studies that have been made on this topic, and to my mind, to simplify it greatly, and this is a great simplification, there are three big steps that we have to take. What's called a decarbonisation of the power sector and transport. So energy and transport are major sectors, as I said, that are generators of emissions. They have to become dependent on decarbonised sources of energy sources that do not, very significantly reduce the amount of emissions that they create, or if it possibly zero emissions. Secondly, a big shift in energy efficiency across our society, of industry, buildings and appliances in the domestic sector and in business. And I'd like to illustrate this point on energy efficiency. If you envisage that I'm going to try and cut this piece of paper in to about a quarter of its size, a 75% cut is pretty close to the 80% that we're talking about. I can do that very easily by folding it in half and then folding it in half again. So, if we could halve the amount of energy we are using, we've got much less to do in terms of folding the other half, in terms of decarbonising our energy sources. The less we do in terms of energy efficiency, the bigger the burden will be on the energy sector to develop lower carbon sources of energy. So in my view, energy efficiency has a major part to play. And then I showed you that a third of this issue is to do with non-energy emissions from agriculture, change in land use and waste. And that has to be part of the equation. Now, I'm not going to say very much about this in this presentation, but I know Chris Priest, who's talking this afternoon, will touch on some aspects of that, and maybe other speakers will too. Now, let me very quickly run through what that might mean, looking through particularly the top two of these bullet points. Decarbonisation of the power sector. Many people think that's just about what I would call conventional renewables, hydro, wind, wave, tide and solar. They can make a contribution, but if you look at the size of the challenge, they're not going to be enough. We're going to have to exploit biofuels and biomass. Now, biofuels can potentially help reduce emissions, but it very much depends on what actually happens in the growth cycle of biofuels. Carbon capture and storage of conventional power generation, energy storage schemes which allow us to spread the energy load across the day, and possibly nuclear power. Now, nuclear power is very controversial, and some people do not approve of nuclear power, but it is part of the mix if you're looking at a decarbonised power sector. I'm not advocating any particular menu of options here. What I'm saying is we're going to need to look at all these options if we're seriously thinking about the decarbonisation of the power sector. Transport. The bulk of transport emissions are currently generated by motor vehicles, road vehicles, as you can see from here. This is again a global picture. 45% from cars and vans, 23% from freight trucks, and a little bit more from other road vehicles. So dealing with road transport vehicles is going to be a crucial part of how we reduce emissions from the transport sector. We also know that aviation and shipping, in fact, are potentially high growth sources of emissions, and that is something that also has to be taken into account. If we look at the major developed economies, about 25% or possibly more of emissions are generated by transport. That's the right-hand column here. It's much less in China and India, but if you look at projections for the growth of road transport in those, and car ownership in those countries, they are going to move up over a period of time in the direction of these richer economies. What are the options for cutting emissions? Reducing travel, that's certainly an option, though it's actually quite, it's almost sort of bucking the trend because the propensity is for travel to increase as economies grow and living standards rise. We can make changes in how we travel, shifting time, shifting modes, and making behavioural changes in terms of driving patterns and so on. But probably the most significant element is going to come from the carbon efficiency of individual travel modes. We already have, in fact, quite strong price signals to car users in terms of motor fuel duties to reduce their CO2 emissions. If you look across at various activities in the economy and compute the various taxes that are applied in the UK into a CO2 value, the motor fuel duty is equivalent to £250 per tonne of CO2, which is pretty high in terms of the carbon taxes that people talk about. It's much lower if you just create an equivalent for air passenger duty, and that would suggest that over time we're going to have to see higher carbon prices in the aviation sector. But there is quite a lot of potential from technology to significantly reduce the CO2 emissions of all the transport modes, particularly for cars, and this is the potential I'm showing on this slide would be through an electrification process, electric cars which are powered by decarbonised electricity. Now that clearly is a process that's going to take time to unfold, that I've been quite struck by how quickly the car industry has begun to talk about electric vehicles. But of course there's two ingredients to that. It's not enough to get the electric cars, you've also got to get the decarbonised sources of electricity. Biofuels may have a part to play. I personally am rather sceptical about the potential of hydrogen-fueled vehicles, because hydrogen is not necessarily a very efficient medium for storing energy. So there are major shifts in the transport sector. A lot of that will need to come from technology and quite significant shifts in the way in which we see the powering of vehicles. I mentioned energy efficiency. If we don't get significant shifts in broader energy efficiency across our economies, there's potentially a massive increase in the requirement for very low carbon energy. So a significant shift in energy efficiency, as I said before, will reduce the load on the future low carbon energy system. It's got to be an important part of the mix. Key areas in terms of energy distribution, transport, buildings, appliances, and industrial use of energy, quite a wide range of areas. I think this is an agenda that perhaps has not been discussed enough and thought about enough. There's been a lot of talk about shifting to a more lower carbon energy sources, but actually reducing energy demand through energy efficiency is itself potentially a big contributor. But there is a potential what's called rebound effect, and you may observe this in your own home. If you have a television, televisions have become much more efficient in terms of energy, but we have bigger televisions now. And so they become more efficient per unit of size of screen, but then we have a bigger screen. And the same thing has happened to some extent in cars, road transport, and in other appliances. We're going to need a wide range of regulatory and pricing interventions to drive investment and behaviour change. So quite significant changes in the structure of the economy, both in energy and transport, and through a renewed shift on energy efficiency. How are we going to achieve this? Well, this is my simplified diagram about the main levers. And they are on two axes. The vertical axis is more about the enabling factors, political frameworks such as being discussed in Copenhagen, and our own domestic political framework that the Climate Change Committee is operating within. And also the use of economic instruments, giving price signals and incentives for people to take the necessary steps.